What's up guys, welcome to this review of Star Wars The High Republic Path of Deceit, written by Justina Ireland and Tessa Gratton. So this is the launch of High Republic Phase 2, although it was never meant to be the launch because the original launch, the adult novel, was delayed to November. That's a key point that has to be pointed out with this review, is that this book came out well before the book that was meant to come out first. So there's some points that we have to get into with that. What did I think of this book overall though? Well, let's first tell you what this book is about. It's 150 years before the High Republic that we've already gotten. It shows us basically a cult living on a planet called Dalna who are calling themselves the Order of the Open Hand. And they are a Force cult who believes that the Force should not be touched, should not be used, should not be manipulated. That if you use the Force here, it'll have repercussions over there somewhere. And that's going to get into some interesting points later on. But this focuses right on this cult, particularly two individuals who are the same race and species as Martian Rowe from the High Republic. These are clearly meant to be his ancestors in some way or form. And a character called the Mother, who is the leader of this cult, who is guiding them, who very mysterious and interesting, who may be the new villain of this particular phase, but we'll have to wait and see on that one. Meanwhile, two Jedi arrive on Dalna to investigate the slew of stolen Force-related items, and they believe the cult might be involved somehow. So, that's what this book is. What did I think of it? I thought it was okay. I think one of the big problems with this book is that it isn't meant to be the start of the High Republic Phase 2. This was meant to be a supporting book, a book that adds to the High Republic Phase 2, that explores certain things in a bit more detail on the side. So it's hard to see with this book what's going to happen next. I will say this one does do a good job of establishing what could be the main villains. I've already said the cult and the Mother. They're very interesting. Are they going to be the main villains though, or are they going to be more of a side supporting villain like the Drengia ended up being? Who knows at this point? It's hard to say because this is not the first book. It's also very small scale. It's set entirely on this one planet, this one location. It focuses a lot on the two species, the Evereni they're called, who are related to Martian Rowe, I imagine. Their relationship is very interesting. They're cousins, one of which is devout and wants to be in this cult and wants to believe everything that this cult says and does. The other one, not so much. They're working for this cult because they feel like they have to almost, but their time is running out. And yeah, the central mystery, there isn't really a central mystery. We know right from the word go, this cult is responsible for certain things. The Jedi are investigating it. But what's really interesting is that the Jedi are not the main characters in this book. So there are two Jedi in here, Zala and her apprentice, who's called Kevmo. They are very much kind of in the background for most of this. They pop up here and there, and they do play a large role, but it's really these two cousins, the Evereni, in this cult who are the main characters. And I think that's one of the biggest problems, is that this book tries to establish these characters as the heroes, as the good people, as the underdogs, let's say. Only their relation with this cult and their beliefs and the things they're saying and doing aren't good, and we know they're not good because of our history with Star Wars. So it's tough to get into this and to relate to these characters in that regard. But I will say the book does a decent job of exploring the characters. It is a very character-driven book. There's not a lot of action scenes. In fact, I don't think there's any action scenes at all in this book. So it is very character-driven. It does dive into the mentality of certain characters. It goes into what the Jedi are thinking and what the cult believe the Jedi do, and it shows you that they have clashing views and opinions on the Force, and that there are even other groups out there who have different views on the Force. That's very interesting. But it's all very surface level at times. So one of the big disappointments is that it tells you what this cult believes, but it doesn't tell you why. It doesn't show any evidence, it doesn't back anything up. Why does the cult believe that the Force shouldn't be used or manipulated? What's the evidence that they have that if you use the Force here, it'll have repercussions over here? Nothing like that's presented, and that's a bit disappointing because it does mean that this cult is just blindly believing these things, and maybe that's the case, in which case say it. But yeah, it's a bit unclear why this cult is so established and why people are in this cult and believe these things with so little evidence presented to us. But I will say, if you know anything about cults, if you've ever seen any movies or TV shows about cults or books or documentaries or anything, this book doesn't exactly bring in a new perspective for what a cult is. It's very much, yeah, stereotypical cult, only it's in Star Wars and it relates to the Force. So that is an interesting little twist on it, but at the end of the day, they are just a stereotypical cult. And there's not much more than that to a lot of the characters here. So I've talked about the mother. The mother is being built up as this big villain. How big, we don't know yet, but she is very fascinating, very mysterious. She's a sort of villain that you love to hate. A villain that's got these little looks and the expressions more than she does words. Yeah, she does a lot more than she says, and that's very cool, very interesting. It makes you want to hate her, it makes you want to punch her. But the problem is that so much of this villain, this character called the mother, is hinted at and suggested rather than said. So you end up leaving this book knowing very little about the mother. I don't feel like I know much more about the mother now, having read the book, than I did heading into the book. All we really know is her name and that she's a bad person. And yeah, there's clearly some weird stuff going on in that regard, but that's about it. I don't know anything about her backstory, I don't know who she is, how she got into the cult, anything like that. The book isn't interested in doing that. The book isn't even interested in focusing so much on the mother. So that's a bit disappointing. You'd think that a book that's really establishing these villains, these bad guys, would dive into that a little bit more, but it doesn't. But it does leave me off wanting to know more, so that's kind of a good thing. At the same time, the Jedi who are investigating this cult, who pop up here and there, they are very one-note and very, I wouldn't even say stereotypical. I don't think they are stereotypical. They are developed. They just don't say or do much that's interesting. Kevmo is a very young, enthusiastic Jedi. He's overly eager. He's overly happy. He likes to see the good side of everyone and everything. He forms attachments and relationships very easily as well. And he becomes a bit annoying, I have to admit. But I think he's also endearing at the same time. But one of the big things is, how old is Kevin? Because I'm under the impression that he's like 16, 17 years old, because they forms this romantic relationship with Marder, and it feels like it's a bit more mature than what he actually is. So it's a bit unclear how old some of these characters are. I think they're on the older side, but sometimes they're saying and acting as if they're on the younger side. So yeah, that's a bit frustrating. And speaking of the romance, there is a romantic subplot here between Kevmo the Jedi and Marder the Evereni. Not going to go into spoilers of where this goes or anything, but it's a will they, won't they kind of thing. How far is Kevmo willing to go being a Jedi? How far is Marder wanting to go being a cultist who's supposed to dislike or hate the Jedi? So there is an interesting dynamic there, but a lot of the romantic elements where they're exploring their feelings and emotions is a bit corny and cheesy. A lot of the dialogue that they share between each other is also corny and cheesy. And I think there's quite a cheeky nod in this book to the romance between Padme and Anakin. There's a moment, one line of dialogue at one point, it's not even dialogue, one line of description of someone in the cult is reading a book about a senator and a Jedi who are in a romantic relationship who have to keep it secret. I mean, it's very on the nose, it's very like, not even nudge nudge, wink wink, hinting at something, but it's like, that should not be in this book. That's annoying. So what? That relationship between Anakin and Padme has happened before? It's based on fiction? It's, what, a prophecy or something? I don't know, it's weird. That book should not exist in the Star Wars universe. And it's kind of cheeky for them to point this out and to acknowledge that storyline in this way when they've got their own romance storyline, which isn't that much better. Then we get into the final act, the third act, where things start to really amp up. And this is where I think the book really starts to win me over a bit, because it gets into thrilling horror territory, and it becomes clear what this book was and what this book was building up to be. Without spoiling it, without spoiling it too much, This book is the equivalent of, say, The Wicker Man or Midsummer. If you know what those films are about, you know what happens in those films, that's kind of where this book goes in terms of the tone and the mood and the feeling. There's an uncomfortable mood and feeling in the back half of this book that's hinted at earlier on, but I didn't really realize it until afterwards. And yeah, it enters like horror territory towards the back end of the book with some uncomfortable, unsettling moments and surprising and shocking moments as well. Again, not going to elaborate on that because of spoilers, but certain things happen to certain characters that I did not expect. And there's an argument to be made that it's rushing things along a bit and that it's establishing backstory of things in the future High Republic, not the future High Republic books, but the High Republic 150 years later. And maybe that gap is too big for what they're hinting at and establishing here. There's an argument there as well. But I did think that the final act of this book was really quite good, and the way things culminated and occurred and came together was really interesting. The way that it showcased how certain characters are sticking with their beliefs and where they are in life and where they want to be going in life is really cool and well done. But I've talked about how this connects to the High Republic 150 years later. One of the a little annoying things is that it does connect so much to other High Republic content so far. So there's mention of the Santekas, there's mention of the Graphs, there's mention of their rivalry between each other, and it establishes certain things that end up being a big thing in the 150 years time. And it just feels like they're really limiting the scale and scope of this story and this galaxy and universe, a bit like how they've done in the movies and TV shows so far. And it makes it feel like this is actually really small scale. And why does everything just have to be connected in such a distinct, obvious way? That's just a little annoying. It's not a bad thing, it's not a huge thing in this book, but it is something that's there, and it kind of bugs me that this couldn't have been a bit more standalone, and that certain characters, groups and relationships couldn't have just been their own thing and then led off into something else rather than being so connected for such a long period of time. So overall, what did I think of High Republic Path of Deceit? I think it's okay. I think it does a good job of establishing this cult, this path of the open hand, but without going too far into them, particularly their leader. I think the book did fail to establish characters that I really latched onto. I think Marda and Yana, the two main characters in certain regards, are somewhat interesting, but I didn't really find myself liking them all that much. Because they are, at the end of the day, villains who are being manipulated, who are, in a certain regard, idiots. And yeah, it's hard to latch onto the characters. I think it's hard to like the characters, with the exception of like the Jedi, but I don't think we get into the Jedi enough to really like them, to relate to them too much. So it isn't the easiest of reads because of that. There is an unsettling element to this book. There is a mysterious element to this book, which kept me wanting to read on to find out what's the point of this book, and it works really well in the end. The end did leave me wanting more. The end did leave me with questions that I really want the answers to, so that's a great thing. Overall, it is a fairly easy read because it's written well. It's not the longest book ever. It is a young adult book. Do I recommend it? I think if you're a big fan of the High Republic, it's hard to say at this point because it is not meant to be the start of Phase 2. It's meant to be a supporting material to Phase 2. I think once we get the first major adult book of Phase 2, it'll be much easier to recommend this, and it'll be much clearer what the significance and importance of this is. As of right now, I cannot recommend it to everyone. But I do think if you want more Star Wars, if you want more High Republic, it's there. So go on. Why not? And if you've liked this review of Star Wars The High Republic Path of Deceit, why not follow me on Twitter and Instagram at @the_Grant_Burton and subscribe to my channel for more content like this. Until next time though, thanks for watching.